In this lesson, we'll edit the lighting to complement the feature lights that we added at the end of the last lesson. Now, I'm not going to do any test render right now because we haven't adjusted the settings to these lights at all. So if I had to render it, it would just probably look all bright white and all blown out. So when you start any type of light setup, we know already that without these feature lights, we already had a quite well renderable scene to work with. But as soon as you add feature lights, it does swing things in a whole different direction because you can't take a day scene and start adding nighttime lighting and try to make it all work together. You need to go back a few steps, back to the beginning, and start setting up your scene from its fundamental lighting step. In other words, the global environment lighting, and then your direct primary light. And then only once you're happy with that, then do you start adjusting your feature lighting. So the first step will be to turn off all of the lights and to basically go back to step one and create a new lighting setup where we have a much darker environment, perhaps a night light and a set of feature lights that then is going to highlight the entire building. So what we're going to do is first of all turn off all the lights that we created. So I also added another little light into this expo box that you might have noticed, and I also added another V-Ray light material, just 2 strips underneath this bridge element, which could look quite nice once it's reflected in the river. So the next thing I'm going to do in order to remove all the lit objects is to either relayer the object that is the V-Ray light material, or you could also go to your V-Ray light material and just turn it off completely. So you could just give this a value of 0, and when you render it out, it will render out black. So the next thing we're going to do is go back up to our top view, and we're going to turn off all of our studio lights that we had set up earlier for all of those test renders. And we can now go to our camera 4. We don't have any lights at all in our scene, and we're just going to do a test render of this now. But before I do that, I also want to activate my override material. Very often, to save time, it's a good idea to not have any complicated materials to render. And as well, if you do have complicated geometry, for example, if these trees had been high definition or high res, it's a good idea to turn those off as well while you're doing your light settings, just so that the process of doing the test renders and your light setup can go a lot quicker. So now I'm going to go and hit pause on the video, and we're going to do a quick render and have a look at the result. So there we go, that's the result. It looks very similar to the render we did in the last lesson where we had that studio lighting on. So what you can see here is that the actual HDRI is creating a huge amount of light for us. It's giving us very good shadows to work with and no sun at all in our scene, and we're getting this result. So that's quite nice because it does give you very quick renders. They do look quite nicely lit because the HDRI gives you quite a complex lighting solution, and you could almost use this just like the white renders I showed you in the last lesson, where you could use or abstract and conceptual renders done in this style. So in any case, I'm going to go into my V-Ray environment setup, and I'm going to change the light that we're using. Also, one of the things that I should have mentioned earlier on as we were going through the render setup in the beginning of the entire course, the image sampler should be on adaptive DMC once we start adding much more detail to our scene. So if you have a lot of big blank surfaces, it's okay to have the last one selected. So just to show you that properly, if you do have adaptive subdivision, you can have that on very blank, big, simple surfaces. But once you have detail and you want to get that good, fine, crisp information, keep adaptive DMC on. It's the preferred renderer that I keep on virtually all the time. So I'm going to now do a test render with a darker HDRI in. So I'm going to open up my materials, and I'm just going to copy out these two so that I have a spare copy in case I do want to go back to that setup. So now I'm going to add new HDRIs. I'm going to just make a copy of these two again, and I'm now going to select some nighttime HDRIs that are within my texture folder. So first of all, for the main lighting, I'm going to use the low-res blurry version. This is to avoid any artifacts within the scene. And then for the reflections, I'm going to use the high-res crisper version. So these HDRIs are quite dark. I need to increase the brightness to about 25 to 30 as far as the multiplier goes. And I'm now going to just clear these two, and I'm going to drag these in and instance those across. So I'm going to now pause the video again, do another test render, and let's have a look at what the results are. There we go, that's a nighttime scene render. So again, no lighting whatsoever. We have our override material on, and you can see that you get some very nice color variation between the reddish and the bluish tones. So that already gives us a little bit more mood and a little bit more of an interesting look to start our work. Next step would be to turn off your override material and have a look at how this nighttime scene is rendering with your materials. So again, let's pause the video and have a look. So here's our render with the materials on. So obviously the reflections are giving it quite a nice look because we start to see the building being reflected around, and we start to see some of this facade coming up in its entirety. But I do still think that we can do a lot more work on this facade. I personally would prefer it to be much more transparent, almost looking as though it was just clear plastic. So we may even remove that double-sided material or just give it a much more translucent look as we edit this material later on. So all of that's going to happen once we've set up our lighting, and we're going to be working with materials and lighting in conjunction as well. So the next thing to do would be to create a bit of a direct light in the background. So if I look in my top view now, the light that we have on this side is going to be too bright if we're looking at our building from this camera point. So if I turn that light on, it's going to blow out these front facades. So I rather want to create a copy, move it a little bit closer to the building, and I'm also going to make it a lot smaller and perhaps even a little bit brighter. So I'm going to just rotate this to face the building, look at it in perspective just so that I can see what it is pointing at, and I'm going to make it a lot smaller. So let's say 20 by 20. And I'm going to give it a multiplier of 20 as well. I'm now going to turn that light on and go into my camera view and just see whether I'm getting any light from it and what it is doing to my scene. So that's the result. It's not too bright, but perhaps we can go and just make it a little bit smaller and a little bit brighter. So I'm going to do that in my own time, just as I tweak that light further and further as we go along. So the next thing to do would be to go and turn on your feature lights once you're happy with your secondary lights. So I'm going to now go in and turn on all of those lights. And one of the things that we need to do before we do any test render is to actually adjust the light settings themselves. Those haven't been touched. So we're going to go first of all down the list, and we're going to turn on our shadows, make sure that that's V-Ray shadow. The multiplier I'm going to leave at a value of 1 or 2. I'm going to start lower and then keep increasing the brightness until I'm happy. The decay is going to be inverse square if you want a realistic result, and I'm going to start that decay at 3 meters. So more or less it's only going to be lighting the area just around the light. I'm not going to worry about too many of the other options. I'm not going to choose area shadows yet because that's going to increase my render time. I do want to have transparent shadows because I have a lot of transparent objects that I want to work with in terms of lighting. So other than that, I'm going to leave it as is. I'm also going to make those changes here to the other light because that has been copied. There isn't an instance between these lights. And let's not forget about our V-Ray light material that we can increase back to a value of 1. So I'm now going to adjust this light as well to make it a little bit smaller and brighter. This should be done beforehand, and you should do a few more levels of test renders as you progress, but just for the sake of keeping the lesson going as fast as possible, I'm going to do it all in one go. And I'm going to now hit pause again and see what the results are. So that's the result with everything being lit up. You can see that there is some glow coming from inside the building, which is starting to look quite interesting. You can see that this entrance pavilion is being lit up, which is quite important to the project so that we can clearly see where the entrance is. These pavilions are looking quite interesting because of how they're being reflected in the water below. And we're also starting to see that the entire floating cube is being nicely reflected in the ground. And we can see that even the podium with its tiny thin layer of water is reflecting nicely. So all these things are starting to work quite well. I'm still not that sure about this canopy. It looks a little bit like an atomic explosion, which I'm not sure if it's that appropriate, but I'm going to keep it lit up as is because it is a very focal element in terms of the arrival access and the vertical circulation throughout the building. So most of those lighting tweaks can be done within your project. I've basically shown you the process until here so you understand the different types of lights between your V-Rays, your Omnis, and your V-Ray light materials. And those are the three that I use, besides of course the plain V-Ray Sun, which I wouldn't be using because I'm doing an indoor studio model type render. So the next thing to do once you start to progress through your renders is to increase your render settings. So here I would go back to a default value of 1. You may want to decrease your noise threshold because we were getting quite a grainy result. You can go and increase your subdivisions. And again, I'm running through this process extremely quickly. Most of the other courses that are in Digital Tutors do have this process in more detail. So you can go and have a look at them if you would like to see more of those render settings. So again, just before I finish this lesson, let me just turn on filter mapping, and I'm now going to quickly render another view, and let's just have a look at what we're looking at for the end of this lesson. So here we have the results of a slightly better looking render, slightly higher render settings, but still a very similar result. So you can see that the render time has gone up, but we still are getting quite a similar result. So this is going to be the end of this lesson, and in the next lesson I'm going to focus on more of the materials as we go and adjust the main skin, because I would like to get more transparency to this and just start adding a little bit more of a flavor to this building itself. Right now it's looking a bit dull. It almost looks like paper, like a lantern, which is what the material is used for, but I want to get it looking a little bit more plasticky as I have this pneumatic air-filled facade to render and represent. So all of that's going to happen in the next lesson.